And now Romans 4:19. Without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. So there's a little bit of a metaphor at work here. Paul has already said that God gives life to the dead and calls into being things that do not exist, and he draws a parallel here between the physical state of Abraham and Sarah's bodies to say that they were as good as dead. In other words, that reality was not lost on Abraham. He, Abraham, was keenly aware of his circumstance. Now, what Paul does here, this work with metaphors, some will take as license to recast a lot of the Old Testament metaphorically with other things Paul says, and that's something to be very careful about doing. Paul has a very specific context here in which he's working. He's making a very specific point about righteousness coming because of faith, not works, and the content of Abraham's faith. So my suggestion for anybody preparing a sermon, okay, is don't make any connections that Paul doesn't make. If you're going to draw up some metaphors outside of Paul's context, it's best not to use scriptures that are working in two different contexts. My suggestion is use cultural images. When I preach, which is very rare actually, I just don't find it all that interesting, I try to find a single cultural artifact or work of great literature and use that as a metaphor, or what is often called your illustration, and I track that throughout the entire piece. It gives people a single reference point. Your illustration is usually the thing that people are going to remember when you're done. The content of your sermon, is a toss-up, or the point rather is a toss-up if they're going to remember it. But if you have a decently strong illustration that is tied to the point of that sermon, they will remember the illustration, and therefore the point of the sermon will. To give you an example, after I preached in seminary, I did this with a book called Viper's Tangle by Francois Mauriac. It's a classic work. Everybody should read it. And I preached the sermon, wrote the sermon, preached it. 2 years later, I was in the hallway. I passed that preaching professor I had. He walked past me. Out of the corner of his mouth, he goes, "I don't remember anybody else's sermons, but I remember Viper's Tangle." so just goes to show a strong metaphor, a strong illustration works well.